One of my favorite characters to come out of Andor is Dedra Meera. Villains often carry the stories because they set the tempo and initiate the action. It makes sense. The hero is often happy living with the status quo. They're living their lives with their family, friends, anything like that when the Fire Nation attacks, someone robs a bank, and so on. And it's usually the villain which inadvertently sets off a chain reaction of events that eventually causes their own downfall. For Andor, while Luthen and Cassian aren't passive, and they do go about their normal lives of smuggling and espionage, it's when Dedra comes into the scene and begins her hunt that our story really begins.
Security is an illusion. You want security? Call the Navy. Launch a regiment of troopers. We are healthcare providers. We treat sickness. We identify symptoms. We locate germs, whether they arise from within or have come from the outside.
And what makes Meera such a good character is because she has limitation. We see her struggle. She's not some all-powerful, faceless entity. She's human. And we see her. She has to work just as hard as Cassian does and Luthen to reach her goals. It's what makes the conflict feel so real. It's not an outcome set in stone. It really feels like any character could win. Luthen could slip up, Meera could catch wind of him, Cassian could be caught sneaking around, flying under the radar, and suddenly get caught or escape. It makes the action points interesting. And interesting is what keeps us watching to see what happens next.
Your need for control is so desperate because it is so unnatural. Tyranny requires constant effort. It breaks. It leaks. Authority is brittle. Oppression is the mask of fear.
Please give the video a like and comment down below what's your favorite villain in Andor. Is it Krennic, Partagaz, Cyril, or Meera? And just let me know what you think. I'd love to hear it.
For buyers and designers from around the galaxy to tour the showrooms and brokerages of this peaceful and elegant metropolis. Ghorman pride is a term you'll often hear, and it will only take you a few hours on the ground to understand the source of that term.
Our first introduction to Meera is her as an up-and-coming ISB bureaucrat or agent. She's smart, tenacious, and has to fight through the bureaucratic nature of the Empire itself as much as anything. Her story is full of corporate espionage and intrigue just so she can go after Axis, who she sees as the greatest threat to the Empire. It's a great mix for a story because on one hand, we get to have the Empire with its limitless resources and overwhelming power and oppression, but inside it are, like any organization, different forces at play. And inside the power politics, Meera has to fight her way to the top and fight her way through to try and figure out who and what is behind Axis. And it's interesting because it gives the story this feeling of unimaginable power that the Empire has, while at the same time gives the primary villain her own struggle, her own limitation. And it's very important because it humanizes her. She's struggling and fighting alongside all the other characters, and audiences love the struggle. That's normally what separates the villain from the heroes, is that you'll arrive in the beginning and everything does according to plan for the villain. It's easy for them and hard for the hero. It's this kind of another aspect that separates the antagonist from the protagonist other than morality. We see the struggle really helps, endear us to a character versus if everything's easy, it really causes us to alienate from them. Compare Meera with Snoke or anyone else who simply exists and we're just told has unlimited power and then tries to go after the hero. Compared with Meera, who has to fight and use her own cunning to rise through the ranks, Snoke just feels completely flat. He's completely hollow and boring.
There is apparently no suitable replacement or synthetic alternative for the Ghorman substrate material.
I see.
It's not for lack of effort. Krennic's had the lab in Edu working overtime all year. I don't know the science, but it's bad luck, Ghorman. We need what's in the ground, and when we're done, there won't be much left to call home.
And no matter how fantastic or technologically advanced a world is, a story needs something to ground it. The audience needs something to connect with that's familiar, something that feels real. And the key is to impart enough aspects into a story that feel real, which sells the rest of the story, which oftentimes is, fantastic or, crazy futuristic sci-fi. It's why in a show we have these tense corporate meetings just to discuss quotas, reports, and finally, how to destroy a planet for its resources to ensure galactic rule. We have this balance. We have planet core mining and space flight, but then we have corporate meetings and, backbiting and snide comments. It's the blend of the sci-fi, fantastic, and futuristic with something we can connect with and understand. And it makes it feel so real that there are people nervously trying to talk to their bosses about realistic managerial expectations, because with any empire, and especially one that spans across the galaxy, you have to have a fully functioning bureaucracy. You have to have an army of bean counters. And with all this bureaucracy, you inevitably will have the interdepartmental struggle. Somebody thinks this way is the best versus that. And especially the disdain and infighting between departments. The ISB treats everyone else like rebels, and in and of themselves, they see spies and betrayal everywhere and, seemingly lord their power and fear over others. And of course, this is going to cause resentment. What this does is it makes it feel that the Empire is something familiar to us. It's a corporate structure. We get it. We understand it. And it feels real. And it's in this environment is where Meera thrives. She doesn't give up, and it slowly begins tightening her noose around everything. It gets so close to capturing Cassian. She has Bix ready to tell her everything, and they slip away. And it's not common to see the rise and struggle of an antagonist. Often what happens is much more similar to Rogue One or The Last Jedi. We have Krennic or Hux who are at the top and simply fail a number of times until they're defeated. We see them struggle, but it's only ever against the heroes. For Meera, she's certainly one of the baddies, but often her struggle is against others in the Empire, other functionaries. So in a situation where it's Cassian or Luthen versus Meera, we'll take our heroes, but then we see her continually fighting against other people in the Empire, and we're given this choice to take her side or the side of these other Empire, functionaries. Whose side are we going to take? And this is what the stories does. We're drawn into the struggle to see who wins, and it's fun to watch. It's a different kind of tension because it's her against others in the Empire. While at the same time, we're not fully sure we want her to succeed because of what it will mean, but I always kept finding myself rooting for her, especially when she came to fight against other people in the Empire,
You'll toughen him up.
I have a different plan in mind. But when I say the word plan, that makes it sound optional, which is not the impression you should be taking away. This game ends now. You want Cyril in your life, you will think before you speak. I'll make sure he visits twice a month. I'll make sure that he calls you. I will guarantee a level of engagement, but it will be inversely proportional to the volume of anxiety you generate in our lives.
Quite a mouthful.
I'm not done. You can spare me the Uncle Harlow testimonials. I've had a look at his ISB criminal files, and that is not a story you want to be advertising.
Her character is able to give the other side of the argument against the rebellion. We have Luke, Leia, Han, Luthen, Cassian, who are true believers in the rebellion and what it means, that it's worth risking war to overthrow the Empire. Meera is on the other side, and it shows the human struggle to maintain that order. What holds up the Empire, what prevents other people from murdering everybody. There's another side to the argument. In the original trilogy, it very much paints the Empire as existing for power and control, nothing else. There's a clip in The Mandalorian that I absolutely love, and it kind of expands on this view for those who are in favor of the Empire and shows why there are people on the other side who are fighting just as hard as the rebels are, but for the Empire.
The Empire improves every system it touches, judged by any metric. Safety, prosperity, trade, opportunity, peace. Compare Imperial rule to what is happening now. Look outside. Is the world more peaceful since the revolution? I see nothing but death.
And it makes the entire conflict feel real because it turns out, there's humans on both sides and they each have their own philosophy. They have their reasons. It doesn't mean that they're correct, but it shows that with each conflict, there are two opposing worldviews at play. It shows that there are real people on either end with deadly consequences on both ends, that these are two things fighting against each other. It's not necessarily, while it is black and white to a degree, that we have the good guys versus the villains, but it turns out the villains have their own philosophy. They have their own reasons for why they're trying to uphold what they see as order within the galaxy. This is the two different philosophies fighting out. It makes the story feel human. And what Meera does for Andor's story is that it helps show that, like the Rebellion, the Empire is supported and upheld by true believers, people who live and fight every day to uphold order, that they're fighting for what they believe in, just as the rebels are. And yeah, let me know what you guys think. What do you think about Meera? Is she, as far as characters goes, what's your opinion on her? Positive, negative, anything like that? Personally, I think it would be really cool, of course, with the caveat, if it was good writing, for her story to continue. I don't think it would work as a solo lead, but it would have to be paired with another character, maybe Clea and Meera end up meeting again down the road in kind of a post rebellion world like the Mandalorian. It would be tricky, but if she turned, you could make it so maybe she turned to the rebel side, probably not, or if she joins a third party, and finds herself in between the old remnants of the Empire and the new budding alliance, that would be pretty awesome, because she's such a cool character. She's really dynamic and really, really, really fun to see. But as always, this would have to be done with good writing, because otherwise it kind of just ruins everything. Because it's the quality of Andor's writing is what makes Meera and Partagaz and all these characters so good, because, largely we're watching, intercorporate staff meetings, and it's like, despite all of this, it's just so interesting and so fun to watch. So, but yeah, that's kind of all I've got. Thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Cassidy, and I'll see you in the next one.